Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapainamu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Manawatia a Matariki. Tēnā koutou and welcome to this Now We Are 12 webinar, where we're going to be presenting our latest findings on young people's experiences of relationships and disability, hosted by our team here at Growing Up in New Zealand. Ko Sarah Jane tēnei. My name's Sarah Jane and I'm the Research Director of Growing Up in New Zealand, and it's my pleasure to be facilitating our session this afternoon. We've got a really great lineup of presenters and panelists for you all today. Colleagues who really believe in the vision of Aotearoa being the best place in the world for tamariki, rangatahi and their whānau. Our webinar today will be split into two parts. So in the first part of our session, we're going to hear presentations from two of our research fellows from the Growing Up in New Zealand study. This afternoon, we have Dr. Rebecca Evans, who's going to take us all through her paper looking at the breadth of relationships that 12-year-olds here in Aotearoa are experiencing and enjoying. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Emma Marks, who's going to be presenting the work we've done to think about experiences of disability for the Growing Up in New Zealand young people and also their whānau. In the second part of our webinar, we're really fortunate to be able to bring together a small panel of experts who I hope are going to help lead us through a conversation about what we can all be doing as researchers, policymakers and wellbeing advocates to ensure that all young people, all rangatahi, can live flourishing lives. I'm going to introduce our panelists just before they join us here on the screen, but I do want to thank them for their time and support today. We've got a team from Growing Up in New Zealand who are in the background, so please do keep an eye on the Q&A function. If you want to post questions as the presentations are going along or as the panelists are in conversations, please do so. Please use that Q&A function and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can live. But also if we have enough time, we might do a bit of a live Q&A with the panel towards the end. So before I hand over to our first speaker, I just wanted to give everyone a little bit of context, please. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So many of you will know that Growing Up in New Zealand is Aotearoa's largest contemporary longitudinal study of child and youth wellbeing. Participants in our study were recruited back in 2009, 2010 during pregnancy, and the team have been following our cohort since that time. The findings that you're hearing about today come from the 12-year-old data collection wave, which started in the second half of 2021, just after the Omicron outbreak sent all of us here in Aotearoa into a level 4 lockdown. And despite all of the challenges that that environment presented for many of us, we're really proud to have completed online interviews with around 4,500 12-year-olds from our cohort and their whānau. And that the data is able to reflect some of the expansive different identities that young people here in Aotearoa represent. So with that sort of brief overview in mind, it's my pleasure to hand over to our first presenter for today, Dr. Rebecca Evans. Kia ora, Rebecca.
Kia ora, Sarah Jane. Manawatia Matariki, and ngā mihi nui to our sign language interpreters for helping us today as well. That's really fantastic. Ko manga kieke toku maunga, ko ngunguru te awa no tamakia hau, ko Evans toku whānau ko Rebecca tēnei. And in this talk, I'll be presenting you with the results from our relationships snapshot. So it's snapshot number 9. The relationships report examines the networks of social and familial relationships of 12-year-olds in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We've investigated who young people are interacting with and how they experience aspects of their relationships with them, including trust and communication. We know that strong social and familial relationships are really crucial determinants of young people's health and well-being. But in order to understand the ways in which these relationships can influence various aspects of a young person's development, we wanted to firstly understand how 12-year-olds today are experiencing those relationships within the specific context of Aotearoa New Zealand. So in this snapshot, we're addressing 4 main research questions. The first is, how are young people experiencing relationships with their parents or primary caregivers? Secondly, how are young people experiencing peer relationships? Thirdly, how many young people have one or more special adults in their lives other than a parent or a guardian? And who are those support people? And fourthly, what are the networks of relationships experienced by young people at 12 years of age? So these are our findings with respect to young people's relationships with their parents and caregivers. And to measure this, we used a validated 8-item scale. You'll see there all the 8 questions before you on the graph. And the questions include things like, I trust my parents pay attention to me, my parents understand me. But before I talk to the actual results, I need to provide some important context to our use of this tool. While this tool can be really useful to look for differences between groups and their experiences of this relationship, and it's a very useful tool looking at the strength of that relationship with the primary caregiver. And this is important in terms of psychological, developmental psychology research. But we have to be mindful that for many families and in many cultures, caring for children is not the sole responsibility of parents. So for many people in New Zealand, including our Māori, Pasifika, Asian and Mila families, the concept of family or whānau itself refers to a wide system of connectedness and connections with both familial and non-familial others. And for Māori in particular, child rearing comes with a principle of collective responsibility, family and whānau responsibility to children. And so young people are considered to be part of a wider whānau, hapu and iwi. So the relationship with the primary caregiver cannot hold the same weight and meaning for these groups. So we've had to be really mindful of this when considering the interpretation of our results. Speaking to the results, so we found that most young people experienced strong, trusting and communicative relationships with their parents. We found that 97% of young people reported that their parents accept them almost always or often, and 92% said they can almost always or often count on their parents to help them when they have a problem. Looking at comparisons between groups of young people, we found there were some differences between young people of different genders, ethnic groupings, households, and area level deprivation. For example, for transgender and non-binary young people, we found they experienced significantly less close relationships with their parents than both cisgender boys and cisgender girls. And another result is that what we often saw was that young people who experienced less close relationships with their parents were also more likely to identify a special adult in their lives. So, for example, young people living in areas of higher socioeconomic deprivation, were less likely to report strong relationships with their parents, but they were more likely to have a special adult in their lives. So we found these to be really interesting results. Thank you. Secondly, slide person, thank you very much. I'm not sure who you are. Thank you. Secondly, we asked young people about their relationships with their friends or peers. To measure this, we also used a validated 8-item scale with questions including, I trust my friends and my friends respect my feelings. We found that overall, most 12-year-olds experienced positive, trusting and communicative relationships with their peers. We found that most young people answered that they trust their friends and feel that their friends are good friends. And again, we found some differences between groups, notably that cisgender girls reported stronger peer relationships than both cisgender boys and transgender and non-binary young people. Excuse me. Thank you. And then we asked young people about the special adults in their lives. So a special adult was, by definition, someone who does a lot of good things for you, but is not your parent or guardian. For example, someone who you look up to, someone who encourages you to do your best, who really cares about what happens to you, and who influences what you do and the choices you make. Young people told us whether they had someone that fitted this description and how many people of this description, and then their relationships to them. Again, this was a validated tool that's been used in international research in relation to mentoring and young people's social networks. But importantly, this tool has not previously been used in Aotearoa. We found that almost half of all the young people in our cohort reported having a special or non-parental adult in their lives. So 47.6% told us they had somebody who fitted this description. And then of those who reported having somebody, they reported on average 4 to 5 special adults in their lives. And these adults came from many different areas of their social communities. And there were grandparents, uncles and aunts, and teachers, and those three were the most common categories of special adult. You can see the rest of those categories there on the graph in front of you. And we found that 2/3 of young people said that they had a grandparent who filled this role, which is really lovely. 1/3 of young people said they had a teacher who filled this role as well. And we did find some differences between groups. For example, we found that rangatahi Māori and Pacific young people were more likely to have a special adult than Seoul European young people. And lastly, we combined the relationships with parents, peers, and special adults to then look for young people's networks of relationships. And as you can see, the largest group, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the largest group, 1,577 young people, said that they experienced, thank you, strong relationships with their parents, strong relationships with peers, and they did have a special adult in their lives. So that represents just over 50% of all the young people in our cohort. The second largest group had strong relationships with peers and parents, thank you, but they did not have a special adult in their lives. And together, in green, we can see that 91.8% of young people experienced 2 or 3 strong relationships in their lives. Excuse me, I don't know what's happening with my throat today. And then importantly, we also noted that less than 1% of young people reported having less close relationships with parents, less close with peers, and no special adult in their lives. So that figure in red up on the corner. So in terms of relevance for policy and practice, there are many ways we could speak to the policy and practical implications of this evidence for young people's relationships. I'm just going to mention 3 themes today. The first is that most young people experience positive, trusting, and communicative relationships with their parents, peers, and almost half of them had at least one special adult in their lives. So these are promising findings, we think, given the Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy's vision that children and young people should feel loved and safe and nurtured and accepted, respected, and connected. It is heartening given what we know about the association between relational support and thriving. Secondly, our results provide evidence to support the context of collective care in Aotearoa, New Zealand. and really recognising that there are networks of support around our young people, including other familial and non-familial adults. So this is important because we know that diversity in social connections really do support child well-being. For example, we know that higher levels of cultural connectedness, which are associated with diverse family forms, have been shown to promote socio-emotional development among tamariki Māori. So policy interventions could therefore engage with young people's broader communities to better reflect these diverse and complex relational networks. And there are several policy settings in which this could be played out, including housing and healthcare and immigration. This is also particularly important in the Aotearoa context, where again, for many people, diverse relational support systems are the norm, and where, for example, many families, and in particular Māori and Pacific families, they're experiencing increased residential mobility. So when young people are moving around a lot, it does mean that the relationships with friends, teachers at their local school, their neighbours, maybe a grandma who lives by, these relationships are being disrupted when young people are moving. So these are really additional reasons why social policies are needed that acknowledge and reflect the importance of young people's relationships, as well as housing systems that enable those relationships to flourish. And thirdly, this evidence reminds us to celebrate young people's diverse relational supports. So young people are identifying members of their extended family and whānau, including grandparents and aunts and uncles and siblings, as well as members of the wider community, teachers, coaches, and family friends, and recognising the special and unique place they hold in their everyday lives. This is important because we know that positive adult-youth relationships are really important for young people's development and growth. And this is evident in other Growing Up in New Zealand snapshots. In the school engagement snapshot, for example, we saw how positive student-teacher relationships were strongly associated with young people's school engagement. And this is particularly relevant for young emerging adolescents, because for many young people, their adolescent years can be really quite vulnerable. Things can become particularly challenging with direct family members. So it really is crucial that our young people have teachers and other important adults that they can go to with their difficulties, or simply to talk to about their everyday experiences within a different setting and a different perspective. So ngā mihi nui for your attention, and I will now pass on to my colleague, Dr. Emma Marks, to talk to you about the disability snapshot.
Kia ora, everyone. We're just making sure our sign language interpreter handover goes well. We're just having a few technical issues. Hopefully that can be resolved in the next couple of minutes so we can make sure everyone can access this webinar. Yeah, let me just hold on 1 second, please. I've got small videos. All right, perhaps we'll just get started and we'll see how this plays out. So yes, my name is Emma, and along with many others, I've had the privilege of working in the disability area for this particular snapshot at the 12-year data collection wave. The aim of the snapshot was that we wanted to take a kind of a unique perspective on disability, and using a combination of both parent and young person's viewpoints, which we hoped might provide a kind of a deeper understanding at both the individual and whānau level for what disability looks like at this age group. We had two main research questions that we were concentrating on. The first was at the individual, which was looking at the variability at 12 years, and this in a family context, and that was what proportion of young people were experiencing and their parents were experiencing disability at the 12-year data collection wave. Next slide. So before we get started, obviously measuring disability is quite complex. For both the young person self-report and parent or main caregiver reported concern, we've taken a sort of a functional impairment approach. And then we looked at that in terms of outcomes for young people who are then at risk of disablement. So for the young people, they needed to have a significant difficulty with either seeing, hearing, walking, climbing stairs, remembering, concentrating, communicating, etc., and also a doctor diagnosis of depression or anxiety. Also know that when we were looking at educational outcomes, we then included those that may have additional learning needs appropriate to this. When we were considering family disability, we were including when there was no disability within the family, whether the young person only had a disability using the earlier definition, and also whether or not either the young person and or both their parents or one of their parents had a long-term disability as well. So that was a kind of a family context approach. And note that this comes with a caveat that we didn't include siblings or extended family in this family disability definition because we didn't have the data. So it has a slight limitation there. Next one. So the first insight was just looking at when we took the young people's perspective on their functional impairment. And then when we looked at the 6 Washington Group questions that we asked for this, overall we found that about 9.8% or nearly 10% of our young people self-reported a disability. And this then differed depending on when we looked at different groups of young people. So we can see from the top that those that were transgender, non-binary or unsure, the proportion was significantly higher at 18.8% than those that were either cisgender girls or boys, sitting at around 8%. When we looked at for ethnic grouping, compared to Seoul European, you can also see that Māori and Pacifica young people had a higher proportion of reported functional impairments, placing them at risk of disability. And then additionally, when we looked at it by area level deprivation, we can also see that those living in the highest areas of deprivation, in this case, number 5, you can see that those with a disability was 15.4% compared to the lowest level where it was 7.6%. Thanks, Joyce. Excuse me. And the second insight, we looked at some of these outcomes, like what the disability status might mean for these young people. And for this, we then combined both the young person's report of the Washington Group and their parents' view on their functional impairments. And that led to there being about 19.4% of our cohort having been classified as disabled. And then we looked at their health and wellbeing outcomes for this particular insight. And so what we can see when we looked at several things for health and wellbeing. I'll just going to do a short snapshot of a couple of them because otherwise we'll be here too long and I'll get in trouble for talking too much. So the first one was talking about quality of life. So we measured health-related quality of life as an outcome. And what we can see from this is that those with a disability reported much lower levels of high quality of life compared to those with no disability at about half. Now you can see that there was poorer quality of life for those with a disability. We also then looked at some mental health outcomes. In this case, we looked at both depression and anxiety scores. So for the depression scores, you can see that again, those with a disability had higher scores, indicating greater symptoms. And likewise with anxiety, you can also see higher scores for anxiety symptoms for those with a disability than those without. We did a little look into access in terms of access to health services for these young people. And what we can see is that, actually can't see it because there's a thing over it, that those that were more disabled young people could not see a GP when they wanted to. So this was almost twice the number than those without a disability. We also asked the reasons for why they couldn't access their GP when they wanted to, and the majority said that they couldn't access their GP because the appointments weren't at a suitable time, or they couldn't get an appointment that suited them. The second most common reason, as Sarah Jane alluded to earlier, was that we were in COVID times, and so COVID or lockdowns had prohibited them being able to see their GP when they needed to. So for the next insight, we looked a little bit more at the relationships for these young people. And so thanks to Rebecca for talking about relationships earlier. So hopefully some of this will be easier. So we looked at a couple of different things with relationships. The first graph on the left, you can see that we asked a question about the parental involvement in these young people's lives, and whether or not they thought they wanted their parents to be a lot more involved, a little more involved, less involved, or a lot less involved in their lives. And what I think is interesting from this is you can see for those with a disability, you can see at both ends of the spectrum, it was different for those with and without a disability. So you can see that they wanted a lot less or a little less involvement in their life, but also a lot more and a lot more involvement in their life compared to those without, sort of indicating sort of just potential wanting of involvement in both ends of their life. And this may partly be due to, you know, wanting a little more autonomy in their lives, and partly also potentially just wanting their parents to have a little more time and involvement. We also then looked at their relationships with their friends or peers, and also their relationship with their parents, as Rebecca's spoken to recently. And for both of those scores that we've talked about, those with a disability had higher scores indicating kind of poorer relationships with their peers and their parents, which again was an interesting finding. And from a slightly more community-based perspective for the graphs on that, we also asked the young people about their perceived neighbourhood safety and whether they felt safe at day or at night in their community and their neighbourhood. And what we can see on the left and right for day and night, you can see that those with a disability were less likely to say they felt safe during the day or night in their neighbourhood. Excuse me. But I suspect these things are largely related to kind of the area level deprivation in neighbourhoods that often families with disability potentially are living in, rather than access-based things, although it can be both, and we're hoping to better look into this a little bit more. We also looked at some of the school engagement for these young people. And so what we found in this, when we've talked about school engagement, we did a school engagement score, which one of our previous snapshots has talked about in more detail. And we again looked at this for those with and without a disability, and we can see from this that those with a disability had a lower scores and were less engaged than those without. And we know the importance of engagement at school and then further flourishing and well-being for our young people. We also then asked them more questions about disabled people, young people wanting to do extracurricular activities. And we could see from those that wanted to do extracurricular activities, there were more with a disability who wanted to do extracurricular activities but were unable to, than for those with no disability. We also asked a series of questions about why they couldn't do the extracurricular activities. Most of these didn't differ by disability status, but they were more to do with time or lack of time, and sometimes it was financial barriers. We also asked a few questions about learning support services and the amount of, and whether or not these families had accessed learning support services. And we could also see some disparities there for those with a disability who hadn't been able to access learning support services, or weren't able to get all that they needed from the learning support services that they required. So for these next two insights, we were talking more about family disability from the definition that we've come up with. So this is where we combined the mother or main caregiver and their partner and the young person's disability status. And then what that showed us was nearly 30% of our families were experiencing some form of disability, which, you know, is quite a high proportion of our 4,500 in the cohorts. And then we looked at these factors more for like housing and family structure type variables to see what the differences there may be there. And what we can see from this is then when we looked at that, we can see that, for example, there was a higher proportion of those with a young person with a disability living in a solo parent family. They were also more likely to be living with non-kin. They were also more likely to be living in rental homes as opposed to in a home-owned home. They were also more likely, if there was a young person with a disability in the family, to be living in a crowded home. And they were more likely to have moved more often in terms of in the last 4 years. They were more likely to have moved twice. And then also they were more likely to have moved 4 or more times in the last 4 years. So you can see that there are some disparities there for families with disability. The last one was thinking about economic well-being. And so then we looked at some of the more financial type variables that we have in the study. We looked at annual income for those, and you can see here quite clearly that those with no disability have an annual income that's considerably higher than those either with a young person with a disability or for those where there was a parent and young person or just the parents with a disability. Just about almost a $10,000 per annum difference. To think about this in a slightly more longitudinal context, we also looked at material hardship. And this was across the data collection waves, across the times that we've collected data. And what we can see quite clearly from this graph on the left is that if you have a young person with a disability, or if you have parents and young person or parents with a disability, you can see that there's a much higher proportion of those in increasing or persistent hardship across the data collection waves than those without. And then we also took a longitudinal perspective thinking about area level deprivation in terms of some of the areas our families were living in. And this was done by basically looking at those who were living in high deprivation, so at the highest level in 5, in this case for the quintile, across each of the 6 data collection waves that we've got information for. And so we ended up with a score from 0 to 6, with 6 being at every single data collection wave they had been living in an area of high deprivation, with 0 being never. And what the graph on the right can show you is that those who had a young person with a disability, 13.1% had always been living in an area of high deprivation compared to just 8% with no disability. And it's interestingly not that different for those with a parent and young person with a disability, but those with the young people clearly had been spending a lot more time living in areas with high deprivation. So, just next slide, please. What does this all mean? So I think I won't dwell on this too much, because I think probably our policy panelists will have a much better insight into what some of this stuff might mean in the policy space and what can be done. But to summarize, to say that disabled young people tended to have poorer outcomes for their health, well-being and education, relationships and sense of safety, and that we clearly see that more support is needed to ensure our young people with disabilities feel safe in their communities, at school, and that includes creating safe spaces that are accessible and appropriate for them. And there is potentially the need to take a more holistic view of these issues as improvements in relation to health and economic social well-being of a whole family can have a positive impact, not just on these young people, but across their lifetime as well. So thank you very much for everyone for listening today. And then I'm going to hand back to Sarah Jane, I believe, who's going to take it from here with the panelists.
Kia ora, everyone, and my thanks to Rebecca and Emma for those excellent presentations. So yes, we're going to switch now into our panel discussion for this webinar. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our guests for this afternoon. First, we have Dr. Amy Bird, who is a registered clinical psychologist and one of the named investigators here at Growing Up in New Zealand. Amy's been one of our co-leaders for the family and whānau domain at the study and brings expertise in the areas of parent-child relationships and the association with children's socio-emotional development, mental health and well-being. We're also joined today again by Dr. Pat Bullen, who is a senior lecturer who specialises in youth development and youth mentoring here at the University of Auckland. Her research and teaching focus is on the factors that contribute to youth thriving particularly during times of transition. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle DeZavenci. Apologies, Michelle, if I've mispronounced your name, I'm sorry. Who is a senior analyst at the Office for Disability Issues, Policy Strategy and Partnerships at Waikaha Ministry of Disabled People. Michelle has a PhD in cross-cultural psychology and completed 2 postdocs in Jerusalem and Paris. Michelle's worked in a variety of roles in our public service, including at the Ministry of Education, Te Arawhiti, Te Puni Kōkiri, and the Office of Ethnic Affairs. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce Renelle Baker, who has whakapapa links to Ngāti Porou, Waikato Tainui, and Ngāpuhi. Renelle lives with her whānau in Whangarei and has lived experience of disability. Renelle has worked in a range of roles across government, health, disability and NGO sectors and is currently the Principal Advisor for Accessibility at Stats New Zealand. With strong community sector involvement, Renelle is also the current Chair of Spectrum Care and has recently been appointed to the board of the newly established Children and Young People's Commission. So tēnei te mihi atu, kia koutou. Amy, I'm going to ask if you might help me kick off our panel discussion, please, and wonder, what it was or what you have found that's really stood out for you in these papers, and in particular in the types of relationships that young people in the Growing Up in New Zealand cohort have been sharing with us.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Thanks, Sarah Jane, and thanks Rebecca and Emma for amazing presentations and all the work that went into both of these topics. It was great to hear about this again today, and I think the thing that really has struck me each time and today again, in particular around young people's relationships, is this is such a kind of key turning point at this age when we think about young people moving into adolescence. And I think there's often a perception for parents as well as educators and clinicians and professionals who are working with young people that at this point many young people are pulling away from their parents or feeling disconnected from them, moving towards their peers. And while that is true in many ways, we get our needs met differently as we develop. I think this data really demonstrates that actually for young people, their kind of breadth of relationships are important, that it's not that they're kind of pulling away from parents and moving to peers or other special adults, that we kind of can only get our needs met in one place, but actually that I guess if we have these strong relationships developmentally, that we can also build stronger relationships as we move into adolescence and get our needs met in kind of from multiple ways and in multiple places. And I think that can sometimes be quite different to how young people can present. And I think that's the great thing that Growing Up has always done, is first of all ask parents for their perceptions, and then as soon as we could ask young people for their perceptions, and we then can find out actually, even though young people might be upset or angry or less communicative with their parents at different points, that actually they are still overall really wanting these relationships, trust their parents, and want to connect with them. So that was the biggest thing for me that really jumped out from the data that I was excited about.
Yeah, kia ora, Amy. I think that really stood out for me too. Like these beautiful, broad, rich sets of special adults, as well as their parents and their friends that are wrapping around young people. I thought was a really important thing for us to celebrate about 12-year-olds and how they're able to create those relationships as well. So I thought that was fantastic. Kia ora, Michelle, I wonder, you do know, because you've been walking alongside us as we've developed up the disability paper, and this has been a really important moment for Growing Up in New Zealand to be able to think really carefully about how we measure disability for young people and in a whānau context. And I think we've learned a lot here at Growing Up in New Zealand about that. So I wonder both your thoughts on the findings that stood out for you, but also how research that reflects the experiences of people with disability can support whaikaha with the policy work you're doing, but also other groups and communities that support people who experience disability.
Kia ora. Thank you, Sarah Jane. So just wanting to acknowledge, thank you for including us early on in the revision process. Disability measurement is a growing field. So for those of you who aren't familiar with whaikaha, we've been established for just over a year now. We have two main roles. One is stewardship across government about disability, and that includes monitoring outcomes for disabled people. And we also have a big commissioning and operations as well, supporting disabled people who have high needs. So disability measurement is tricky, and I think you've done a great job combining both self-reported measures of 12-year-olds as well as parental measures. There's a lot I could talk about, but overall, I'm going to start with what I wasn't surprised with. I wasn't surprised that disabled 12-year-olds had overall poorer outcomes, because that is what we find across the 8 outcome areas of the New Zealand Disability Strategy. So education, employment, health and well-being. Overall, they're much poorer outcomes by those who are in the disabled population group. So I was not surprised by the findings in this report. Although every time you read them, you still are disappointed that that's the case and shocked to what extent that is the case. However, not surprising. But I was really interested in the differences between family composition, where you have either the youth who is disabled or there's wider disability in the family. In Table 1, you had quite a few significant differences between families where just the youth is disabled compared to non-disabled youth. But it's really interesting. I was wondering, where did this come from? Because they had the same level of support, low levels of income, as families where there's wider disability in place. So I just was interested in the nuances between having disability in the family versus a family where only the youth is disabled. And I was wondering if that could be related to family structure, because there's a higher chance of living in sole parent families. I see Emma is nodding. But in your sample, it wasn't a question of the support they were getting, because both types of families were receiving equally low income and experiencing high levels of social deprivation. So that's something to investigate in the future. In terms of what your findings can do for government and for whaikaha, I actually would like to relate the findings at the moment to the Ministry of Education. They have a learning support action plan which provides different kinds of support. You see in this sample, about a third of the participants had some of the support that they were receiving. And just over half were receiving all of the support they required, which is wonderful. But then you had another proportion who were not receiving any support. And it just underlines, first of all, it will be really interesting to follow these two population groups. So how are the kids who are receiving all the support they require turning out later on in life compared to those who are receiving only some of the support or none of the supports? But also just really underlines the importance of inclusive design and upskilling our teachers to be able to feel confident when they are teaching children with disabilities in the classroom. There were some error reports released last year that talked about the importance of teachers feeling confident and upskilling teachers, and also the fact that a lot of disabled, I'm going to rephrase that, some disabled children are not able to attend school full time and are experiencing barriers. So just looking at that side would be really supporting current efforts for inclusive education and universal design. And increasing the support students receive. So thank you so much. I'll be happy to answer more questions later on, and I'll pass the mic to somebody else.
Well done, Michelle. Thank you. Thank you for that. I think and we've seen this in many of our other snapshots that, you know, some of the findings are shocking and not surprising. And so really encouraging us, as you are, to think about, so what do we do next? What are our different responsibilities to ensure that those inequities don't remain in place, and these young people and families do receive the support they need. So I appreciate that. Ronelle, I wondered if I could bring you into this conversation just here and ask how you saw the findings from these papers, and perhaps if there's anything from the work we've been doing and growing up that reflects what you understand young people's experiences to be.
Kia ora tātou, and I must apologise. I can't quite get my camera to work today, so I apologise. You have a static image of me, which is probably more flattering. But anyway, I can give it a go and try that again, but unfortunately I end up with a blank screen, so I might just leave my static image on today. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you to the presenters and the team who have been behind this really important piece of work. So I guess one of the key, I want to tautoko what Michelle has said in terms of education and access to learning resources, but also I guess pull out some things that are really resonating for me. In terms of the rates of disability that this growing up in New Zealand sort of 12-year-old cohort has found, the prevalence rates of disability are certainly higher than the 2013 disability survey rates, which is quite an interesting finding. And I think we are so the disability survey will run again later this year, and then we will have refreshed data. So it will be really interesting to see whether there's a shift in the national population kind of statistics around prevalence rates for children. I think that the higher prevalence rates for tamariki and mokopuna Māori are consistent with 2013 disability survey results, and I think this is a broader kaupapa, and definitely it's very hard to talk about disability prevalence for Māori without looking at the pervasive impacts of colonisation. And I think that's part of the reality of these kind of snapshots and what they tell us about people's life circumstances and outcomes and the disproportionate impact for Māori. And I think that if we look at the strengths and the protective factors in there around having a whānau system around the young person and their broader whānau context, you know, these are the things that we need to strengthen and support. And so I think in terms of taking things forward for policy and practice, I'm looking really at the concept of enabling good lives, which is one of the big transformational pieces that is happening in the disability sector. But alongside enabling good lives actually came from a whānau ora model. And one of the conversations that I've been having with my colleagues is around, if I'm whānau Māori, do I have to choose? Enabling good lives is very much centred around an individual, disabled individual, being supported within their context to develop their aspirations in life, whereas whānau ora is about uplifting a whole whānau. And I think for many of our Māori and Pacific families, the whānau ora model is actually going to be a stronger fit. So I just wanted to note that as part of this kōrero. The other thing too is that employment conditions for whānau carers also is something that Carers New Zealand has been speaking out about for a long time. They've been asking to build on, you know, the carers strategy, and for, so if you look at, say, the material hardship, the deprivation rates, a lot of that is linked with employment and opportunities to actually have stable employment and to I guess increase your personal income does get impacted. So Carers New Zealand have spoken out strongly about the fact that parents who have a child with disability support needs, they don't choose a life of poverty, but often they choose to support their whānau member, and that means that they're trading off some of those career opportunities. And so I think the way that we can support pathways for whānau parents who are supporting a loved one at home as part of their whānau system really should be looked at in terms of setting better employment conditions and supporting whānau carers as a whole. Yeah. So there's one final thing, sorry, and then I'll hand over to something else. And it was something that Emma mentioned about the safety. So feelings of safety, and I was curious about that as well. And Emma, I do agree with you that sort of interrogating whether that is to do with the area level deprivation and the kind of social conditions that people are living in. But I also did wonder whether it may be to do with other forms of discrimination. So if we've got higher numbers of Māori Pacific and children and young people identifying in that transgender non-binary group, it may be that other forms of discrimination are kind of factors that are contributing to those feelings of not feeling as safe. So yeah, really interested in finding out more in that space. But ngā mihi, I shall hand back to someone else.
Kia ora, Renelle, thank you for that. I've been noting down some of the points that resonated with me there, and it is the real opportunity we've had here at Growing Up in New Zealand to provide some evidence that I think can sit alongside the work that was presented as part of the recent Waitangi Tribunal hearing. So that is really important to see the context in which many of us on this webinar and in this study are looking to support whānau whaikaha. And you know, those ideas around the cost of care and the cost of manaaki for whānau and for their rangatahi mokopuna, I think is another really important point. I'm going to come across to you, Pat, and I know in my little introduction, and we talked about your interest in transitions, and at this point in the life course, I think as Amy even pointed out, our young people of this age are experiencing so many developmental and social transitions, and so we're really hoping the evidence we're creating helps us all support them to navigate those transitions, whatever they look like. And so your thoughts, please, Ehua, about how you see these two papers sitting along some of your other work with youth and young people.
I do want to acknowledge to the presenters and the panelists and the kōrero that we've had today, because it's really important. And I think I also want to acknowledge that, you know, if we're reflecting on the relationship part of the story or the paper, you know, there's a good news story there. And sadly, if we reflect on the findings from the paper around disabilities, you know, there's definitely some work to be done in that space. And I think if we think about transitions, one of the things that is so important, and I think that is highlighted to me, is relationships. And it speaks to the importance of whanaungatanga and how we've seen across our various papers that relationships, whether it be with caregivers or peers or important or special adults or teachers, are critical to youth thriving. And so, you know, I think relationships play an important role in building up the mana of our young people, to offer them to really prepare for these transitions that they face going forward. And I think the important role that many can play in ensuring all of our young people thrive is so important. And it's funny, I was reflecting on a quote some time ago by Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who said, all young people need to have at least one adult who is irrationally crazy about them. And I often, when I present this to my students, I say, I think that's important, but I think we need a whole village of adults who are irrationally crazy about our young people. And I think that the more adults that we have to support our young people and to build them up and prepare them for adulthood, the better it will be. And I guess it speaks importantly to policy in terms of what we can do to create communities where adults are made available to young people to support them, how we can support whānau to have the opportunity to spend time with their tamariki, because often they're working and have other commitments. And so it's thinking about those
those ways in which we can support our young people through caring adults. And one final thing, Sarah Jane, is I was really inspired by the fact that we see special adults or important adults are highly prevalent amongst our young people living in more marginalized communities. And I think that again speaks to the fact that there is the presence of important and caring individuals in all of our communities, and we just need to work hard to make sure that these are made available to our young people, and reflect on how we can ensure all young people have access to caring individuals in their lives. So I will stop there.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Pat. I mentioned previously in our panel discussion how much we've learned here at Growing Up in New Zealand about how we measure, how we talk about, how we reflect experiences of disability and disablement for young people. But I wonder, Ronelle and Michelle, if you might jump back in and for our audience here on the webinar, help us all think about how we can all do better to ensure that people who experience disability, but particularly young people, mokopuna, that their needs and priorities are being kept at the forefront of all of the work that we're doing, that they and their voices are being heard through policy, through research, through advocacy. Can you share some insights for all of us on the call?
Is it okay if I start, Ronelle, and then I'll hand it over to you? So there's been a cross-agency group that Stats New Zealand and the Office for Disability Issues were co-chairing, called the Disability Data and Evidence Working Group. And one of our roles was to encourage agencies to measure disability, both in survey data and in administrative data. There are different ways this can be done. It's more complicated than measuring other demographic variables like age, because it can include identity. Disability is very context dependent, and there is an international measure, the Washington Group short set of questions that is good but doesn't include everything, and an extended set which includes mental health. But if you use that, then you can't use mental health as an outcome that you're looking at later on. But really, we've seen a huge increase in data in the last 5 years, monitoring outcomes for disabled people, because agencies like Stats New Zealand and Justice and Health have been including some of these measures and reporting on it. So we at Whaikaha would really like to see disability as a standard demographic variable for all reports, just like gender and ethnicity and age and even region. That would really go some way to help us understand and monitor outcomes. And I did want to mention the methodology you use in terms of combining both parental measures and self-report measures. I thought that was an interesting take, because actually in your very detailed methodological report, there was little overlap between these two groups, which is surprising in terms of how young people view themselves compared to how their caregivers view them. And another big question that we're looking at is whether there's flux or change in the population of those who are disabled. And Josie helped look at this in more detail this week. And actually about 50% of those who identified as disabled at age 12 had already been picked up at age 8. But you can see that another 50% basically were picked up between ages 8 and 12. So you can look at the development of disability, but also 23% of the 12-year-olds at time 2 who were identified as disabled when they were 8 years old, no longer identified as disabled at year 12. So it's a population that is changing. People keep on identifying as disabled or having impairments, and some continue over time and leave. And we'd really be interested in looking at differences between these groups. Sarah Jane, you mentioned one more thing in your question. Actually, I wanted to reflect back, if it's okay with Ronelle, because I put my hand up briefly. For my colleagues here working in EGL at Whaikaha, I do want to say that whānau is central to the EGL approach. And in terms of choosing to look after whānau, but not choosing poverty, this is such an important area. The MSD is currently commissioning more studies into the cost of disability and the direct impacts and indirect impacts of having disability in the family. And so we'll really be looking forward to those results next year, and just wanted to tōku MSD for the research they're doing. So I'll hand over to Renelle now.
Tēnā koe, Michelle, kia ora, kia ora anō. So I guess in terms of my final comments regarding capturing disability status, is the first thing I want to say is that this is an area that is really fraught, it's complex, and disability, it's not a Māori term, I'll start right there, and second of all, it's not strengths-based, it actually has been stigmatized and comes from a deficit-based model in the history of Aotearoa. So our history of labeling people, treating them as special and different, and institutionalizing them or being charitable to them is real, and that's been explicitly spoken about through the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State and Faith-Based Care. And you know, we had that legacy as a country. So it's very difficult for people to identify proudly as a disabled person, even the terminology. So here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we use social model language, which says I'm disabled because of external barriers. I'm not a person who needs to be fixed. In Australia, they use person first language. I'm a person with a disability, so call me a person first. So we have differences of opinion in the sector and in our own communities. In our own Māori space, we have whānau who identify as whānau hauwā, and others who identify as tangata whaikaha Māori. And so that is just, I guess, speaking to the diversity within our own communities. So measuring in a way that is acceptable and resonates with a broad group of New Zealanders is always going to be difficult. So I think you've done a great job. And I think one of the things you've mentioned in your release material is that you didn't say to children or young people, are you disabled? Because of course, most people at that age are not going to identify with that label. And so I think that's really important. What you focused on is the areas that they're having difficulty with, so your functional activity limitations. And some people will argue that that's not that's not very strengths-based, that it's more that biopsychosocial model, and that is just the reality. But in terms of giving us some relevant data that enables us to track outcomes and measures, I think Michelle's absolutely right. There's a big piece of work going on around that, and that there is a lot of support for collecting data more regularly and monitoring and reporting on outcomes for both for disabled adults and children, young people, tamariki mokopuna. Where I'd like to see some more, I guess, work being done is in that relationship with Māori, with developing ways that are more, I guess, holistic and recognise identity in more holistic ways. So if you think about the conversation starter is about who are you and what support do you need, not what's wrong with you. And so, you know, in Te Ao Māori, you meet someone, they go, where are you from? Who do you whakapapa to? You know, that's your conversation starter, not, oh, how did you end up in a wheelchair? You know, and that's the mind shift, that's the conversation shift we need to have, I think, in the data collection space.
Kia ora, Renelle, kia ora, koroa. That was really, really interesting. And again, just really important reminders for all of us, really about our assumptions, the way that as researchers, I'm a researcher myself, that we let tools do the work for us, perhaps rather than connecting and engaging with the communities who we wish to do research with. And so I really appreciate both of you sharing your your challenges for all of us in our collection of information and insights around experiences of disability here in Aotearoa. I've noticed the time, and we have gone over the time that we had set aside for this webinar. So I'm going to just start our wrap-up session now. And something that we do here at Growing Up in New Zealand when we're interviewing and asking whānau to complete questionnaires with us is that we do ask them about their hopes and dreams for their futures, for themselves and their children and young people. So Amy, I started the panel with you, so I'll come back to you and ask, what are your hopes and dreams for children and young people here in Aotearoa?
Oh, that's a big question. I really hope that the richness of social relationships that we see at this point, that we can track and see that relates to wellbeing and flourishing as we'd hope it would, and that we can, that these findings can have impacts for people who are working directly with young people, in terms of not just inviting along the young person and maybe their parent, but thinking about who's important in their lives, and who is a key support for them. I'll keep it short and sweet because I know we're
Thanks, Amy. Pat, for you, your hopes and dreams for tamariki rangatahi?
I guess my hope and dreams would be that all young people have a community of important adults, whether that be caregivers or others in their lives, that are there no matter what to support them, that they feel loved and cared for throughout their journey.
Pat, for you, Michelle, would you share your hopes and dreams for children and young people here in Aotearoa?
That they all have a high quality of life. That's something that comes through, especially in the disability report, because that will impact well-being, engagement, relationships, of course, but high quality of life.
Kia ora, Michelle. Kei a koe, Renelle. Your hopes and dreams for mokopuna here in Aotearoa?
I would say that they're valued and recognised for their uniqueness and just their value as taonga for all of us, actually. Kia
ora. Well, thank you all for sharing your hopes and dreams. I think it's a nice way to send that energy out to our participants here on the webinar, and to all the people that have been involved in this work, so I appreciate that. So we have reached the end of our session this afternoon, and actually the Now We Are 12 webinar series that we've been hosting here at Growing Up in New Zealand. So I want to start by thanking our presenters today, Emma and Rebecca, and the teams that you've worked with. A big mihi and acknowledgement to our panelists this afternoon who have really challenged us all to think about the importance of young people for our whānau, for our communities, and for greater collectives here in Aotearoa. For those who are on the webinar, and this will be available as a recording on our website, I really want to encourage you to think about these snapshots as an introduction to the research, to the data and the insights that Growing Up in New Zealand can create for all of us. And so do please encourage you to visit our website where you can find information about the study, and in particular information about how you can all be using the data sets for your own work, for your own research, for your own policy making, and for advocacy for tamariki and rangatahi. We have a recording available on our website now from our recent data access workshop, which will take you through the process of preparing an application to use data for your important research questions. So please make yourselves use of, feel free to peruse the website and make yourselves known to our team if you have any questions. So finally, again, I do just want to acknowledge everyone who's been involved today. Thank you very much for your time. I have to give thanks to the fantastic team at Growing Up in New Zealand for all of the work that's gone into the Now We Are 12 series. In particular, our partners in government who have supported the Now We Are 12 reporting process, in particular Ministry of Social Development, And for everyone who's engaged in the webinar series and hopefully sharing the insights with your own communities. But before I wrap up, I do need to extend our deepest gratitude to the rangatahi and whānau of growing up in New Zealand, who are part of the work that we've been doing and who really help to lift up that vision of Aotearoa being in the best place in the world to be a child and young person. So nei rā te mihi, mai oha, kia koutou, kia tātou katoa, mauri ora.